And how's it going? And welcome to the Roll for Stats podcast, where we're going to be talking about life, D&D, and whatever the frick else comes up. You're joined by co-host me, No Fun Allowed, and co-host Stan.
Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing?
Today's topics will range from dungeons to factions and, whatever else. But most important of all is we are going to be rolling a character. And today we are rolling 4d4 plus 2 down the line. Are you ready?
It's extremely generous, considering my last character, actually, the 1d18s, or just the regular d18s, that character came out really good.
So I can't believe it, because you had a 50-50 chance of being complete doo-doo, and he
just
didn't.
Terrible. I only had one negative stat. Everything else was actually, like, very, very good. The 18 was amazing. But 44 plus 2 is going to be a bit different. So let's go ahead and start. Did you have a character sheet? Did you?
Yes, you do.
Let's see here. Edit directly. So let's go down the line. Let's see what my strength is going to be.
Oh, I'm waiting with anticipation. 44 plus 2. So the floor is very high, but it's very hard to obtain that ceiling. Very hard.
14.
14 strength.
Not too bad.
14 strength. You're going places.
Let's see, next one.
16
dex.
Oof.
Look at this. This character's already looking pretty promising, considering my floor is 6, which is still pretty terrible.
Yes.
If you get a 6, that's terrible. Here's con. Extremely important stat to roll good on.
And 9.
Yeah, here we start seeing the turntables.
9 con.
Intelligence.
10 intelligence. 10. Average.
Not too bad.
Average.
Don't need to change the stat at all.
10 wisdom. Okay.
13 charisma.
13 charisma.
So this character's not too bad. No like terrible stats.
No terrible stats. The only negative you have is your health.
Yeah, which is actually pretty bad, honestly. Like, out of all the ones you can have a negative in, you really want to have a negative in either, like, int or charisma, because charisma's a little more common, but int have very few saves. They do apply to a lot of skills, though.
It applies to all.
Con does not apply to any skills, so I have no negative skills, but my con is pretty low. So this is going to be probably a dex character.
What do you do with a dex character who's got, some strength behind him, with some charisma, but really not much else?
Let's look here. Let's see what racial bonuses I can get.
You could transform this into a lot of things. Getting that 16 does let you bump up that to an 18 at level 1, which is OP. But you may try to, like, flesh out the other stats a bit more. It's really hard to say.
Yeah, the problem is it's, there's not a lot of classes that rely on both strength or dex. It's usually either or. But with most other classes, you kind of want a little bit of everything else.
It's funny because, unfortunately we bring up, old school games all the time, but there was a point in D&D where you would want both strength and dex, because those two did tie in together when you dealt damage and attacked people. But
yeah, you expressively you would have, like, a higher dex, and you can get a feat that allowed you to use your dex bonus for your attack rolls, but always your strength damage bonus was tied into your or your damage bonus was tied into your strength somehow. Now, if you're like a rogue or somebody, you really don't care too much about strength, because you get that insanely high sneak attack damage. But,
yeah.
It did matter. It mattered for a lot of classes.
And then even in older D&D, there was composite bows, and composite bows could draw upon strength, which is, in 5th edition, if you're a strength-based character, you're never going to touch a bow ever. It's just not going to happen. So that's pretty interesting to think about, how the game has changed over time, the difference between strength and dex. At one point, they were somewhat married together, and now they are happily divorced. they do not interact at all whatsoever. Specifically, Rogue, too. Yeah, we just mentioned, but Rogue is like... I would love for there natively to be strength-based rogues, because I think that should be a thing. We look at Conan the Barbarian. That dude is not a barbarian on paper. That dude is a thief. He is a rogue.
Well, he's like a rogue barbarian multi-class.
Yeah,
which is something that was actually very, very viable in older school and 3rd and 3.5. That was a very, very powerful class combination.
For
And
sure.
I think there is, you know, and again, this kind of ties in. It was easier to get to those higher stat points in older edition D&D when you're doing point buy. You could very easily, without even having to roll stats, start with a character that had 20 in a certain stat. It became very expensive, and you would often have a lot of lower stats as a result, but you had a little bit more flexibility, and I feel like the stats are maybe balanced a little bit better instead of having most characters that are dex having strength as a dumb stat. That's very common to see because they don't really need it.
Yeah, I feel like the
Other
majority of 5e adventuring parties, strength is definitely something that can be left off the table because you don't need it. And, there's only, what, two classes that are tied to strength, really, barbarian and paladin. But other than
well,
that,
fighter kind of is a little bit, isn't it?
fighter can be, but you can easily just build a dex-based fighter and it's no
Do you
issue.
need to have a high strength multiclass with a fighter?
No, it's strength or dex.
Is it okay? That's interesting.
Yeah, so they definitely like basically read it as a fighter. You are either strength or dex, not natively strength.
Not one or the other.
And then something to note is monk in particular. Monk on paper is written as dex, but you and me, we of course played alongside a strength-based monk, and I thought that worked out perfectly fine.
Yeah, I think that stuff is really cool, and it would make sense within the context of what kind of character you're building. There's a lot of martial artists who are about being quick and elusive, but there are also ones that are all about hitting hard and very powerful blows and attacks. And I feel like the monk's increased unarmed damage reflects that a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily reflect it so much that it impacts what way you build your character. Because unless you go like Turtle, which has like a set AC, you really kind of need the dex for the AC bonus for Monk.
Oh yes, the more I'm tooling around with 5e or just any role playing game, I think natively if I had rogues or not just rogues but monks at the table, I think I would allow them to swap out their native stat because once again that whole being tied to a one stat, what ends up happening is you want to play the best race for that class. So what ends up happening is you'll never see a Dragonborn monk because Dragonborn don't get Dex bonus, and then you never see da 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 because they don't get that Wisdom bonus, right? So I think it would be fun to see more of that. Obviously, if you're using Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, you can go ahead and monkey around with the bonuses of your racials and stuff, but I don't know how many DMs and groups are going to allow Tasha's transfer stats. I feel like that's going to be something very prevalent at some tables, but not at every table. And I'm still on the fence about it myself because I like the portrayal of certain ancestries and all that, but obviously it's got its own set of whatevers.
Well, I think, and especially the more experienced you become in D&D, you realize you don't need to make a character that's 100% optimal. You don't need a character that's going to have 18 or 20 in any stat, really. And I think some people are afraid of making a mistake because they may take a racial option that doesn't give them stats that are oriented around what they want, right? Like how big of a meme is the halfling wizard, right?
Yeah,
Or
the
the
halfling diviner wizard that takes lucky and then later on bountiful luck. Your intelligence is going to suffer if you go down that route because there's no way it doesn't because you don't have an intelligence bonus. You're taking 2 feats, but at the same time, the character is super flavorful and you get to, do a bunch of fun stuff with it. That's
yeah,
dope.
and I think it's looking beyond stats and kind of looking into what my character can do. I mean, I have in my group that I'm going to be DM for later today, actually. They built their characters Well, but they didn't all build them super optimally. We have got a lot of people who their highest stat are 14, but they kind of have more of an even spread. Um, and I like that, you know. It makes it to where I'm not always feeling terribly challenged in fifth edition to give my players or my PCs challenges that are both balanced um, and rewarding to fight that don't feel arbitrary. Because you get to a point with player power, and we've touched on this before, where it becomes a very delicate balancing act where it's like you can introduce an encounter that steamrolls your party, or you can introduce an encounter that you think is going to be challenging for them, and your party just walks all over it. Um, and when their stats aren't all hyper high tuned and everything, you can kind of take it easier. Maybe it's a little harder to know exactly how things are going to balance out, but the whole thing about D&D, especially with challenge rating, is it's a little bit unreliable because every group is going to be so different, from the class composition you have to how many players you're playing with. It all varies.
And I think the
And
most important factor of all is the human factor. You could hand the exact same character sheets to the exact same number of people, but if you have the encounter with, three different groups, the encounter is going to shake up three different ways. And
absolutely.
it is interesting to think about that. But once again, that's just something you're going to have to develop over time. DMing for that group, you are going to figure out what their tells are. You're going to figure out what their go-tos are. You're going to figure out how they interact with each other, and then you build the game around that. So for the first little bit, you need to, throw out a generic stuff, and hopefully you build up the confidence over time to tailor this beautiful game around them. And I think that's really, rewarding once you do get to that fine point where you can sit there and say, my party's strong enough, they can fight a demi-lich. My party's confident enough. I'm gonna throw them in a beholder slayer, and hopefully they get out. You know, you eventually start to you push the players more and more, and you do discover if they like being pushed or not. You do discover if they can rise to the occasion, or you discover that you need to ease off the gas a little bit, and that's perfectly fine too. It's entirely group to group dependent, really.
Well, and I think the best thing you can do for your players is understand what challenges that you can give them, and not just the characters but the players. What challenges feel rewarding to the players? What feels like a great triumph? And sometimes it is killing the dragon and having a whole session long combat encounter that's got twists and turns, and it looks like they got him and then they don't, and then it turns around somehow. And sometimes it's a political victory done through roleplay. Maybe it's about convincing the neighboring kingdom to sign a treaty with the kingdom that your players are representing, right? And that's really going to depend on what your players are looking for in your game. But I think something that is always fun, in my opinion. Now, I know this is debatable, but it is in the name of the game. But certain dungeons, when you build those, and I think that people have an idea of what a dungeon is, but really a dungeon is, it can be many things, right? It can be it can be that series of skill challenges that your characters have when talking to certain representatives. Um, and most commonly, it is a place that's filled with monsters, that there's a lot of combat and some puzzles and some things like that. But you can always, as a DM, flavorify those things in different ways.
Yeah, the dungeon doesn't have to be this sprawling metropolis of wandering monsters and the boss's lair. The dungeon can be as simple as it's right underneath the shop owner's shop, and there's two rooms, a broom closet, and you got to fight some giant rats, right? That could be the dungeon, and that's perfectly fine. The dungeon doesn't have to be one thing because the dungeon is everything. As we just mentioned, dungeons are in here, and maybe there is dragons in your game. There doesn't have to be dragons, but I certainly think that dungeons are a key aspect of this role playing game that we're playing, because we want to touch upon the three pillars of this game: exploration, roleplay, and combat. And dungeons, while they've satisfied the exploration part, they hopefully satisfy the combat part. The roleplay part in particular, that's usually something that's a little bit tougher to throw in there for depending on the situation, but it's easy to do. You can easily have any number of characters in that dungeon that are willing to interact with the party. Mind you, it doesn't have to be on a good state of terms. You could have villains that, interact with the party. But if they're willing to interact in a roleplay sense, that's fun. Having that villain that, answers over the magical PA system and, threatens them and then laughs at them. And when the players finally approach and find that villain in the corner where he's got nowhere to run, that's a rewarding encounter because you've been berated by him this whole time and then you finally catch up to him. Or it could be, the same person over and over again is fighting the party, but they always teleport away, or they always, activate some, trap door and escape down to the next floor. You can always have, you can just always have the three pillars easily in a dungeon, but it entirely depends on the circumstance. And that is definitely something we have to strive for, is when we're making these dungeons, how do we fit in what our players want in them?
Well, I think more so you can also ask yourself how can this, how can this cater to the players where it feels important and it feels like they gained something when they left, but how does it also tie into the greater aspect of things? Is this a dungeon that is tied to the main plot that is going to carry the plot forward? Is this something that players kind of heard about through word of mouth and they decided to investigate it? Maybe it's part of, kind of a stepping stone of different things that brings the players there, and then they leave and they realize, okay, there are these other things that we need to do. There's a lot of tools that are at your disposal as a DM when you're making dungeons that you can really tailor it however you want. And I think some of the dungeons that are my favorite personally are some of the ones that are bigger, that do have combat, but it's not every time you open a door there's a combat encounter. You might go into a one room and see a mural that kind of give the players little tidbits of information. Maybe they come into a room and there is a pedestal that's got something missing on it, and the players don't know what it is. And through discovery and exploring the rest of the dungeon, they find it out and they're able to put it back, and maybe it opens a door somewhere. There are these, little tidbits of interactivity that, as you kind of put them in, they promote your characters to be more observant and more interactive with the setting you're creating. But I think it's very important to know that these things are all in your control. And I think especially when you're making it, don't feel afraid to kind of scrap some of your ideas and maybe restart either. I think that you need to kind of give yourself some time to kind of see what the overall purpose of the dungeon is.
Yeah, we really have to sit down and when we're creating these dungeons in particular, we do have to recognize what our players can actually do. I personally would love to throw in puzzles into some of my games, but I recognize that one of the groups I'm DMing for, they're not exactly the grandest on puzzles, so I do have to tailor that back. And in regards of combat, you have to sit down and decide: do you want combats to be every single fight is a fight for their life, or do you want it to be where there's multiple strings of fights and they slowly wear and tear on the players? And you have to consider that, and then you have to consider the traps. How deadly are the traps? Are the traps save or dies? Are the traps, once again, just slowly draining resources? Are they time consuming? I think that the biggest trap of all that I know has, scared every single group I ever run, and I think you can attest this, is a door. I put a door at the end of the corridor, and it takes 20 minutes to figure out.
A closed door is very scary, but a party who has thaumaturgy can sometimes, don't underestimate thaumaturgy. It is such a good spell, especially for just like, yeah, there you guys see a closed door at the end of a very cramped hallway. It's 20 feet long and 5 feet wide, and they've got to get into this tight marching order to go down it. It's like, okay, like who's gonna be the one person to go down there and open the door? Because, do we all really want to like nestle into this hallway? And it makes your players think. And you know, sometimes there's no trap. Sometimes there is a trap. And, I think your players always will be kind of worried that there is a trap there, but they're not quite sure how to get by it. I've heard some people criticize traps as being a cheap way to do things in D&D, and I don't know. I kind of can understand their points with it. I think that it's just like, oh, you walked here and all of a sudden something happened. Well, the DM needs to, I think, keep in play or in check the passive perception of the group. That is always a good thing to kind of have, on hand, just every single player's passive perception or character's passive perception, and know that, okay, if this is a DC 15 trap to see, if someone's got a 15 in passive perception, they might see it. But that also can help encourage your players to actively be like, I search for traps. But
Yeah, that actually touches upon something in particular. When we're role playing, we either, are putting on our voices and saying things aloud, or we say my character does this. But when you're in the dungeon, there is that weird notion of my character would not be stupid, right? My character would be actively looking around. But the thing is, if you don't natively express that, are you sitting at a table where the DM says, you didn't specify you were looking down, so thus you step onto this? Or are you playing in a game where you have to, just simply walk down the tunnel and the DM tells you if, there's a trap or not? And you do have to, this is totally case-by-case basis. I definitely think that there should always be the assumption that the player or the character isn't stupid. But at the same time, if something is natively hidden and the person didn't actively search for it, then it would make sense that it would be hidden.
Well, and sometimes the trap can be something that they're interacting with directly, right? Maybe it is a puzzle that if they put the pieces in incorrectly, something happens, right? Maybe it can be something that is a little more in their immediate view and they see it. And if they make a mistake, then there is a trap that gets triggered, right? The classic Indiana Jones takes the golden idol off the pedestal and a big rock comes down is a great example. It's like, okay, here's something that is obviously of note. Is it trapped? Versus, the tile 10 feet or 10 squares ahead is trapped, and it's completely indistinguishable from the rest of the tiles in the hallway. I think one feels a little like, okay, well, I guess we either just didn't see it or whatever, versus something that the players need to actively engage in before the trap is triggered. And I like the latter of those two, just myself, but I think that's just me.
Yeah, and I think that also touches upon something as well is, as DMs, we of course monkey around with some stuff behind the scenes. We of course fudge some rolls every now and then. But I know for a fact
Shame on
that
you.
a lot of DMs sit there and, oh, a trap just suddenly appeared, That definitely happens, where your players are going somewhere and you just think off the top of your head, you know what? I think I'm going to go ahead and throw them, a loop right here. Like, I didn't have a trap planned, but as soon as they open the door, a dart's going to spring out and shoot one of them, kind of thing. And that is definitely something to consider is, are you the kind of DM that wants to keep it, legit? Are you going to write out the dungeon and then that's the end of story and you're going to, keep true to your word? Or are you going to try and tell a riveting tale and thus change some stuff on the cuff? And, I've definitely added some stuff, on the cuff every once in a while, but more often than not, I do try and keep whatever I write as written because I think it's more organic that way, and it keeps me honest. It's definitely something you gotta reconcile with yourself. Is are you gonna operate on like a 1-to-3 ratio or 1-to-4 ratio every four locations that there isn't a trap? Then the next one is gonna be a trap, etc., etc. Or is it just gonna be you have a trap here, here, and here, and then that's that? Your players may or may not interact with it.
Yeah, and I think that kind of also comes into not metagaming as a DM, which is a little weird to hear, but it is a thing that happens
Oh
is
yes.
DMs metagaming, and you really need to be cognizant that if you constantly are doing that, your players are going to catch on, and it's not going to feel organic, and it's not going to feel good, because it pulls them out of that immersion that this is a believable setting, at least somewhat, that have a concrete set of rules that are consistent. Because I think people enjoy playing within the rules. I mean, rules are what make games fun. And if, the DM's just constantly kind of breaking the rules or bending them to give you guys a hard time, it's not going to feel very fun. It's going to create kind of an adversarial relationship between you and your DM. And there are certain games I think that is something that exists. I think there are some games where there is like a quote game master and the players kind of are operating a little more directly to thwart him. But within the context of D&D, especially 5th edition D&D, I don't think that's a very healthy thing to have. You definitely don't want that feeling that the DM is out to get you, especially if it ends up being one person that seems to be triggering all the traps. And not because that can happen because they're the one who goes up and they're like maybe the rogue who took Dungeon Delver, right? And they're like, yeah, I'm intentionally going to go in here and be try and trigger these traps because I'm the best one to be suited with them. But it's just that one fighter or that one paladin who just constantly gets hit with traps when other players aren't. It's like, okay. So I think it is being honest as a DM is very important. And I think making those traps that are tied to more, tangential things that exist within the dungeon, I think that's where you need to be focusing some of your efforts to kind of say, okay, yeah, this is an important thing. If they mess this thing up, there might be an encounter. If they mess this up, it might be, something might happen. If they drink the water out of the well, that would be a very bad thing. It's a story that I'm sure you'll tell one day.
Oh yes, that's definitely
But
going on story time.
and that's an example of something that is like, something that the players are trying to figure out, and something bad happens, and they're like, okay, we know not to drink out of this well of water anymore.
Anymore.
But it was an object that existed that seemed like we could interact with it, and I think
Oh, you could
that's where
definitely
it's
interact with
fun.
that one.
Yeah, absolutely. But that exists as something that's more fun. I think traps in a boss encounter can be cool too, right?
Oh yes.
I have this one encounter in one of my campaigns that I've made where there's an ancient white dragon, and there are these large like pillars of elemental ice in his lair. And if the players get too close, they can suffer frost damage and potentially lose a bunch of movement. Uh, and that can be something that exists. But I think you need to kind of say, these things glow with an unearthly wintry glow, and kind of maybe imply that these are something that the players don't want to be near. But maybe not. They may get the other idea and say, oh, we need to hide behind these pillars to avoid the frost breath, and then they take a bunch of frost damage anyway, right? But there's a lot of ways to make your traps fun and interactive. And even though it is typically something that punishes the player, as the nature of a trap would, it can still be something that doesn't feel frustrating. I think that's the worst thing that you can do is just kind of throw in things to your players that just constantly frustrates them when they're trying to play the game.
Yeah, those roadblocks certainly get in the way of not only the characters exploring the, whatever, the dungeon, but it also is frustrating to the players because They want to do things, and that is honestly the crux of it all. We sit down to play whatever role playing game that we're doing to do something. We typically don't, play these games to do nothing. I'm sure there might be some role playing games where you sit around and do nothing, but we typically want to explore. We want to discover. We want to have those interactions with the world. And yes, of course, you should throw roadblocks in some places, where it makes sense, but it shouldn't be a constant uphill climb of trying to, finagle with every little thing, every inch that your players go that they have to, clamber over something. And I'm not talking about physically. I'm talking about like a more, hurdle in
It
regards
feels
of the game.
tedious. You don't
Exactly.
want to. You don't. You do. As the thing is, 5e already takes a long time in combat. Well, any combat based, D&D does typically take quite a while to get through. And if it just feels tedious, and that's really bad. It's really hard to get out of that kind of tempo, because it's like, okay, well, you guys have had 3 combat encounters so far, and I plan to have another 5, and you guys are already sick of the combat because each combat encounter was long and arduous and took a bunch of session time, and you know didn't feel like the players were really accomplishing anything or got anything out of it. That's something you really want to avoid.
For
Tedium is the enemy of your players.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet that over the course of however many campaigns that have ever fizzled out, it's probably not because they were, exploring around and having a fun time. And then they just decided to stop. It's probably because the players got bored. Simple as that. The players wanted to do something. The players wanted to go out. The players wanted to interact with the world, and the DM was not providing that. That of course might be on everybody's fault. The players might have, not picked up what the DM was putting down, but of course I'm willing to bet that the DM was putting down something that the players just couldn't perceive. And that is where that open communication needs to be, that you need to interact with everyone at the table, not just, DM to player, but also the other players need to talk with each other and say, hey, I want to do this. I want to do that. What do you want out of the game? Because we are all human beings that want something different out of this game. And of course, you might have a party of 4. 3 of them might want to go out and do dungeon delving. But then you've got that one person that says, nah, can we just like chill in town and talk to that one NPC? And then you're going to have a conflict of interest, and you're going to have to reconcile, what do you guys want out of the game, and what does the game mean to you, and all that. It's definitely something that is very important, is that this game means so many different things to so many different people. Some people hear Dungeons and Dragons and think it's all about going into dungeons and killing dragons. And if you're running that game, that's awesome. But obviously, in today's day and age, D&D is a lot more in regards of trying to weave a super duper elaborate story. And for some people, if you want to run that game, that's great. But once again, not everyone is down for that. You just gotta take that on a case by case basis.
Well, I think that's knowing who you want to invite to your table. And sometimes you will have players who just have totally different ideas of what they want to do in the campaign. And you really need to, I think a session 0 is very good. I think you really need to kind of set the tone and the expectation of the campaign, not only for what you how you plan to run it as a DM, but how you kind of expect your players. I don't want to say how you expect them to play it, right? But I think that your players need to kind of all understand how they want to play it together, because it can be very jarring where, yeah, you have one player who is just totally in a different direction than the rest of the party. And sometimes, and it doesn't need to be done on like a mean scale or anything like that. You just need to say, look, man, uh it doesn't look like you've really kind of, you're kind of going on the beat with the rest of the party. We may have to ask you to not come back. or something of that manner. Obviously you want to phrase it maybe a little more diplomatically, but if they're not willing to kind of do something that the rest of the party wants to do, and it's like it's totally different than having a character that is someone who it's having a paladin who is like sworn to destroy undead, and then having a wizard in the party who is a necromancer. That's more of an RP issue, but I think it's more about how people are consistently trying to play characters. Is this someone who really wants to PvP the party? Is this someone who you know wants to everyone in the group has decided to kind of do this one thing, and he just kind of wants to go against the grain just because, right? Or has just like no interest in what the party is doing, and it's just like, yeah, we're gonna about to go to this location and do this dungeon, let's go. And then this one player is just like, nope, I don't do that. I want to stay in town and do my blacksmithing stuff. It's like, okay, well, you guys are at that point really playing two different games. And you know you've just everyone needs to understand what kind of game they're going to be playing when you play D&D, or at least what you all kind of socially agreed to play when you play D&D.
Yeah, and those session zeros, you do get to interact with everyone, and you do get to see if they can get along well. Especially because if you've never played with this person before, having that session zero and seeing how they interact with everyone else and interact with you is a very good sign. But of course, that doesn't give you everything. Which is why, in particular, when I run a campaign, I always run a session 0.5, which is a one-on-one with that person. And once again, that can also kind of gleam in on the kind of person that they are and how they interact with the world, how they interact with you, and just how they play in general. And then eventually it all comes together with that session 1 where everyone sits down at the table and finally gets to playing. You can, if you definitely see the signs that there's someone that's probably not going to be right for the group, then you want to catch it early, because it would suck to be running a session, in particular, this happened to me. I ran a game for, 16 sessions, and then I sat there and said, I don't think this group's just going to work. It doesn't work right. The party comp is just, or not the party comp in particular, but specifically the player composition was just not clicking together. And that sucks. It sucks to have to sit there and do that, but you do have to sit there and consider, is this a game worth running? Because you never want the hobby to become a chore. Never.
No.
If at one point you're sitting there and it's about to be session time, you have to ask this to yourself: are you excited to show up, or are you just showing up? That is definitely something you should ask right before you're about to join a session, because if you tell yourself right then and there, man, I'm just showing up to the session and that's that. What are you getting out of it, right? Like, if you know that you're not going to be in for the greatest of times, if you know you could be having fun doing something else, then do that instead. D&D and role-playing games, they are hobbies. They are something we go out of our way to do. And for the DMs in particular, they do a bunch of homework, and maybe the players themselves, they're doing homework as well for this role-playing game. But if it becomes a chore, then it is not worthwhile. Because I would hate to have to do a chore and sit there and not be excited about something for the next 2 to 4 hours of my life. That sounds miserable.
Well, I think it's a matter of kind of saying like, well, and I'll say this: D&D always, in some level, is a little bit of a chore, especially if you're a DM. Do not expect it to not be work, because it is. But if you said it, if you're excited, that's the big difference. If you're excited to sit down and do it, it doesn't feel like a chore. And you have to ask yourself why you're feeling like that. And if it has to do with your players and not your the PCs, but specifically the players, then you need to start talking to people, both, probably outside a session. If there's something that's really bad that needs to be confronted right then and there, that's going to be really hard to get everyone to get over. If there's like a big, argument at the table about it, that can kill your group right there. That will kill the campaign. People will say, nope, it was a bad experience. And if it's someone's like first time playing D&D, it may turn them off of D&D for good.
Oh yeah.
So I think you really need to know as a DM who you are inviting to your table. Do you know for a fact that this player is going to be a problem player? And if they are, don't invite them. If it arises in the session, be a little more, kind of talk to them a little bit. You don't need to kick them out right away, but kind of say, look, man, things aren't driving with the party, and your character seems really intent on like killing this other PC. Would you be okay maybe rolling up a new character, or maybe, playing this character in a way that's more conducive to playing with the group? Because at this point it's causing a lot of friction in the group. It's threatening to derail the campaign. I really, if it's someone you really want to have at the party, kind of say, look, we would still like to have you play with us, but unfortunately this character is not compatible. Now, you know, sometimes you may say, look, I don't want this person back. And at that point, there may not have been enough vetting done. But, you can sometimes be surprised. Sometimes you'll see some players you'll bring into the party who will be really good when you didn't expect them to be. And then you have some that unfortunately can get sidetracked and kind of get into their own thing.
Yeah, so
I
going down the line
Go
of,
ahead.
the player separated from the character, you of course can get those players that you know for a fact they would be awesome to play with, but when you sit down and play with them, they suck. And that might be because they are truly playing that character up to whatever it is that they built them to. But this very important thing to consider is if someone is playing a character and it's very just not meshing well with the game, and they say those dreaded line of "it's what my character would do," that is roleplay terrorism. Don't allow it. At some point, both the players and the DM need to step in and say, "Nah, we don't want this. We don't. If your party is a group of people that all joins together and thinks of all the tactical stuff and all the role play, and then you have that one person say, "Oh, I just go in and stab the noble." That just doesn't mesh well with the party, right? You need to sit there and have some limits on how far someone's willing to go against the grain, because this game is typically you start somewhere and you're traveling along and you get somewhere. You get to a finish line. You're going in a one straight forward line. But of course, there can be a lot of zigzags and whatever else. But if you have the majority of the group going one direction and then one person going another, not just in the physical sense yet again, but also in the narrative sense, that just does not work. It really doesn't. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
Well, yeah, and you have you know, I think one thing that can also be a red flag ahead of time is if you have someone who has no interest in the party, like ahead of time. Like they're not. One thing that really like when I hear someone say this, right? And when they say, "Well, I think I'll choose my class once I see kind of what other people are going to play, so I can play something that fits the party well." They're thinking about it as being a team player. They want to do what's best for the group, and they want to do what's best for the team, both in and out of character, which is great, right? I think some people, and you won't have every single person in the party be like that, because then you'll have no one picking classes.
No, you pick. No, you
But some
pick.
no, you pick. Go ahead. But sometimes you can have everybody come together at that session zero and say, okay, let's make your characters. What do you guys want to play? And then they'll all kind of talk amongst themselves, and they'll might say, oh, maybe I kind of want to try out a rogue. And they're like, okay, you'll play the rogue, and if you play the rogue, then I'll play the wizard. You know, uh, and you have them kind of come together at that. And I think that's why that session zero is so important. Is you test the waters with everyone, and there are red flags that you can see during that creation period, that is going to get, that is going to be a problem. And sometimes seeing that process can change the way certain problem players are going to be. You know, you might have someone come in and they think it's going to be like this, and then they see the way everyone's working together and they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe I won't make that like regicidal character who wants to go around killing all the nobles. You know, it seems like the rest of the group wants to do this. And I think as a DM, kind of say, look, you know, this is my expectation of you. I expect you guys to work together. I don't want you guys to be killing each other in PvP. I really want you guys to, you know, to work confidently as a group. And I think if you keep those lines of communication open between both yourself, you to your players, and your players to each other, you're going to have less of that happen.
For sure, you definitely need to be very transparent. Like it does suck, especially if you are trying to air quote have a fun time. You do have to get real. You do have to get honest with everyone and say, okay, there is no PvP in this game. One, because that just gets in the way of the storytelling. I want you guys to be a team, but you know, two, most role playing games are not balanced for PvP, so don't even try. But yeah, in regards of the adversarialness of the party, you can definitely have the party be, antagonistic toward each other, and I think that's fine, especially if it is a driving force, especially if they are trying to constantly one up each other with awesomeness. That's great. You can definitely have those. If you have like two rogues in the party, for example, you could have them be, okay, I stole, from that nobleman and I stole his hat. And then the other person goes, oh, I got to top that. And then that person goes and steals the noble's pants. You could definitely have those fun moments where it drives forward together. And then, of course, if you have two thieves that are out competing with each other, you can have a ton of fun with that in a city setting for sure. But yeah, having the group constantly working with each other to make each other better versus working against each other to make the other worse. One of them works extremely well. One of them does not have a place at the table. It really doesn't.
Well, yeah, I think that you can have competition between players, and sometimes there can be, and even sometimes there can be situations where there is quasi PvP, where players are pushing and wrestling for an object from each other. I think one good rule of thumb is don't ever draw your weapons or start casting spells, because as soon as you start doing that, as soon as you pull your weapon out and the other guy pulls his weapon out, it's real hard to de-escalate that.
Oh yes.
And you can tell sometimes that the characters themselves are doing it, but the players are fully cognizant of how the role play is going to go, and they're kind of entertaining this kind of theater of, yes, I do this thing, and it is like, oh, how it damages my trust with you, but whatever. But the players aren't mad at each other. There's a problem when both the actual players themselves are like upset about it, and they try to use their characters as avatars to get back at the other person, which is its own form of metagaming. I played a session whom three of the players were all brothers.
Yes, yes.
And what you could definitely tell, there was some sibling rivalry. The oldest of the brother and the youngest of the brother would very constantly like come to blows. And it almost did one time, and luckily they had a traveling companion who was a wizard who cast counterspell to try and curtail a fight, because the players were starting to pick sides, and the party was splitting a little bit, and it was gonna turn into PvP really quick if someone started casting spells. And it was just, it's like, man, what a stressful stressful ordeal as a DM. Because you're sitting there like, oh crap, all of it's coming tumbling down,
All
and
my hard work wasted.
but then there are other situations, and I don't want to say too much, but me and Consul and our friend Gojira, we were all together in one campaign, and there was an item that I had that they stole from me, because and there was some metagaming going on. It was a cursed item, and they were like, "Oh, you're acting really weird," and I'm like, "Well, no, I'm just I don't want to give it to you. And so they ended up stealing it. And it was like a point of conflict, but our characters never started to attack each other or hurt each other or try to kill each other. I think as soon as you start coming to blows and you're rolling attack rolls over athletics checks or acrobatics checks, that's when you start getting into the okay, it's getting a little out of hand here,
In
right? And I
I
think
remember that scene in particular too. There was you guys had an NPC with you all, and that NPC threatened to leave you all if it did escalate any further. So I think
yeah,
that certainly helped out as well. But
hmm.
you know,
And
as a DM, you have to decide: are you going to step in as just an NPC in the world around them that says, "Hey, you guys shouldn't do this," or are you going to step in as the DM and say, "Hey, this is BS. Don't do this." You do have to decide if because you do need to stop it at some point. You do need to sit there and disallow it because I've played in campaigns where that PvP was very prevalent and it led to a terrible game. It sucked having to constantly worry about PvP and constantly having to worry about people going backstabbing you or going up against each other. That sucked. And I definitely don't
yeah.
want to put anybody through that again.
Well, I think there's a as a DM, you can obviously be as transparent as you can, but there's only so much that you can do to curtail it when the game is happening. Sometimes you just need to look at the players and just tell them no, no, you don't do that. And they'll be shocked and be like, no, I do. And it's like, no, you don't. And the reason I'm telling you no is this. And I think sometimes people can get very passionate about it, but at the end of the day, you guys are all together playing a role-playing game for multiple hours usually, uh, and you want everyone to have a good time. And it's not only not a good time for whoever's going to be losing in the PvP exchange, but it's not going to be a good time for anybody else at the table. If you have two players constantly feuding, and then there's another two or three or four other players, it's going to be very grating on them too.
Oh
You
yes.
know, and you as a DM, you really need to you're presenting the tone of the environment, and sometimes you gotta shut that down quick, because if it doesn't, and if it and you can shut it down, and then after the session go to each of the players and say, look, man, what's going on? Why is this becoming an issue? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, most people are reasonable and will kind of say, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have done it. But I've definitely had players before who saw nothing wrong with their actions and probably would do it again if given the chance.
Absolutely. We've DM'd for those people from time to time, and that I mean it sucks. You do have to sit there and reconcile with it. But mind you, it doesn't have to just be the DM, of course, that does this. I wholly and highly encourage other players to step up with this as well and intervene, because as the DM, we for some reason are tagged as being the social leader of the group when that does not need to be the case. Of course, it can be everyone has that potential to have that initiative, but for some reason we just have this mentality that the DM needs to be the one that handles all this. And just step up and say something if you see something. If you know it's not going to work out, the worst thing you can do is do nothing. That's the worst thing you can do. You definitely have to curtail everything that would hamper everybody's fun, because of course two people at each other's throats, or two, in your case potential it sounded like the party was literally split. That's just not fun. It just isn't. It's gonna suck.
No. And then at that point, there's an issue with some of the players you're playing with. Sometimes there's a little bit of an issue, with expectation, right? But definitely be on the lookout. Know your players typically before you invite them to your games. It always makes me very, very, very nervous when I'll have random people kind of ask me like, "Hey, can I come in and join in this campaign?" Especially if it's a campaign that's already going. And my answer is almost always no. because if I'm the campaign's progressing and if everything seems very smooth, unless you've had a player drop out and you need another slot to be filled, make sure there's some sort of like social reference. Say, if is this someone who's coming in that knows one of the current players and that they can vouch for them, or is this someone who's just answering a random thing that you posted? You know, really, really, really vet that player good before you invite them into something that's already going on, because that can mess it up too. You might say, look, everything was going fine, and then we had someone come in here and not know kind of the pace of the game, and he killed the player or killed the character. Excuse me, he didn't kill the player, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Like there can be, or they can feel they might be indirect, right? Where it didn't come to actual combat, but you know they did something that ruined an opportunity for another PC. It's really, you really got to be sure about who you're inviting into your games. Know who plays together well too. Don't invite two people who argue all the time. Is it don't invite a husband and an ex-wife, of two people that are still like fighting, or going through a divorce. Like maybe yeah, they're both your friend, but maybe you should invite them both to the D&D table. Um, because it's not going to make for a good game.
I think one of my horror stories as a DM was I DM'd for a couple, and lo and behold, a few sessions into the campaign, they both came to me and said, "Hey, we've broken up, but that shouldn't be that big of an issue." It was a very big issue. later
I
on,
imagine.
later on, at first they were being very cordial about it, and I was like, okay, maybe it'll work out. But this was early in my DMing career, and I did not fully recognize all the signs. And then eventually it did come to a fact that there's a reason why they broke up, and they did not belong in the game. So that campaign came to a grinding halt. And, that does suck, but it's better to end a campaign than to continue on and have to deal with, the mess. And,
Yeah,
speaking
no, I totally
of
agree.
pushing along here, speaking of that, let's go ahead and take a look at your character. What have we got cooking?
So we got a stout halfling named Fralk Alropo. So far he's got some studded leather armor, a short bow. Probably gonna go with a short sword for his weapon.
Makes
Can you
sense.
can you use a short sword as a dex as a halfling?
I'd have to double check. I want to say yes because it does sound like it does sound like a
I
a
think I'm pretty
roguish
sure
weapon.
you can with a short sword. I think it's a long sword you have to use two-handed as a halfling.
Short sword. Short sword is finesse light. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, and then how much a short sword? Because I remember I got 120 gold on this character, so I got a little bit of spending money.
I mean, I'll tell you what. He had the high deck, so he was thieving
10.
for a while.
Yeah, he was, right? And we'll see what I go with the background. I got to you typically take the background before I take my normal skill proficiencies, just because,
You don't want to
with the
overlap.
background, those are not flexible. With your character, they are.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get a background that gives you things you already get, and then you just get the other things that you normally can get, so you're very skilled. But let's see here. Short sword is only 10 gold. Actually, not bad at all.
Not bad.
Let's
Just
see.
just think, a peasant would never be able to buy a short sword ever,
Yeah.
because the D&D economy is. Fun fact: the D&D economy is not based on any sort of realism at all whatsoever. It's based on how much money would realistically, or not realistic, but how much an adventure would get. Because
Making your D&D economy is so fickle,
oh yes,
especially if you're in like an urban setting where commerce is an extremely common thing. A lot of time, your players will kind of want to know a little bit about it because they want to make money, because there's a lot to spend money on. And sometimes working a job is good. Sometimes, you know, uh, adventuring usually, especially if the DM deigns it to be a very good source of income.
As it
But
should be. You should be rewarded for going out and doing crazy, dangerous stuff. That's the whole draw of the fantasy world, is that there are tombs that are ancient that yearn to be discovered. There is crypts that need to be delved into because they hold some long forgotten treasure. If you make a fantasy game and it's not about the fantasy of it, then I feel like you should just be playing another role playing game. You know, you obviously can have those campaigns that aren't about delving into dungeons. You can have those campaigns that aren't about going off to do crazy over the top stuff. But I think it is important to sprinkle in the fantasy, sprinkle in the non-realistic, because heck, even in the real world, at some point, specifically, 100 years ago, people were delving into tombs. Indiana Jones, of course, is a made-up character, but people did go into those Egyptian tombs. They did go into the temples in Latin America, or even, the ruins of wherever it is in the world. And people did plunder those places. And I think that is important to fit that in to some degree, because we want to experience things that we can't experience. At least if you're playing a fantasy role playing game.
well, I think another thing to ask, is obviously in D&D there are magical items, right? And are you going to allow those to be bought with gold, or are they going to be something that is exclusively out in the world that is super rare, super, super hard to find, super powerful, but very infrequent? And, you know, depending on which ones you kind of decide to do, you kind of want to temper it and say, look, there might be some minor magical items for sale in the city. Maybe if you find the right kind of person to do business with, you might be able to get something a little more substantial. But for the most part, really powerful magical items exist out in the world, and you certainly aren't tied to whatever is listed in the core rule books. I very 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 much of the opinion that I'll use some of the magical items in the rule book, kind of have some of them in there, but I like to create my own for my players, and sometimes I like to create something that feels very good for some specific players to use, right?
Yeah, because obviously the ones in the DMG, those magical items are very general. A lot of the magical items could be used by anybody, but then of course you do have those specific items that say can only be attuned by a spellcaster, can only be attuned by the sorcerer or warlock, or whatever the case may be. You have those items, and those can feel very personal to the individual, of course, but more often than not, you want to delve even deeper than that. Maybe you want to say, hey, I've got a monk in my party. I want to give him something cool to make his punches different. So you make a magical item that makes his fist do fire damage. Simple as that. And that feels very personal. Very minor stuff, but making the weapons more magical in the world makes it feel a lot more fun, I feel like. If you definitely tailored minor items or even major items to the players, that is awesome. Mind you, you can't, not that you can't, but if you have it where your players go into a dungeon and they find the exact right item for the people, that does, spell out that you are, giving them everything.
In a world where only great swords are found
Exactly.
and there are no battle axes or long swords because no one of the party uses, yeah, you want to occasionally sprinkle in items that might not be like the most useful to the party, but sometimes it can be used as like, hey, you guys don't have any plate wearers, but you guys find a suit of magical armor, right? And that can be something that the players could sell, or that they could give to an NPC, or they could use it to somehow get some other type of useful currency, whether it be gold or social status, or maybe they trade it. Maybe they know someone that they could trade this for a different magical item, and you can always kind of add things in. I have in my Thursday session we have a cleric who follows the god Nobanian, which is like a lion god of nature and nobility. And through his role play and through his actions, his holy symbols on his cape. And after a while, I was like, after you've done this great deed, after you've done this thing that greatly pleased your god, the cloak became magical, and it gave him some specific bonuses that were only specific to him and followers of Nobanian. So it was kind of another way of like introducing an item, or taking an item that was already kind of precious to the player and making it even more special and making it even more personal to them. I find that's a little easier to do with characters who have like some kind of divine inclination, but there's all sorts of ways that you can do that. You know, does the fighter get a cool sword because he helped a barbarian tribe, and as a gift they present to them like an ancestral blade that's really powerful and cool, right? There's a lot of cool ways that you can tailor in special magical items that you are more intended for specific group members, and that they earn through certain role play venues. And I feel like those are the things that are always a little more precious to the players.
Absolutely. They will cherish, depending on how frequently they get magical items. If it is infrequent, they are going to cherish them. You give your players a magical item right from the get go, and then they're going to say, "Oh, that's my item. I want it." And something I've done for my latest campaign, I gave all my players a magical item, and then I stole it, and now
Yeah, you did.
they all want those items back, and I think that's a very good drive. The fact that they got these cool stuff, and then they had it for a brief moment, and then now they've lost it. It's like, okay, I can dangle that in front of them at some point. They want those things, and that's just one example on how to get your players chasing after something. But of course, just dangling the reward in front of them in the first place is saying, hey, scouts have told us that in that Lich's tomb there is a staff, and that staff is super duper powerful. But of course, the thief that went in there, he nearly died, and he only saw the thing, and he got out of there. Maybe you can go in there and go and discover it. And when players go in, they can have a romp and roar and good time, and they actually have a goal. They actually have a drive. And then when they actually get to the item and they actually get it, then they have that sense of accomplishment. When they look at that item, they can reflect on, oh, do you know what we had to go do to get this thing? We had to dodge that saw blade trap. We had to fight that Lich's ghost. We had to fight that troll on the bridge. You can have those great stories tied to these items, and I think that is definitely something that we want. We don't want just something mechanical. We want something to remember. And
Well, if they can always remember how they got the item, right? That's really cool. You know, like I remember I did one quest for one character, in one of your campaigns where I this character wanted rats. He wanted little rats to he saw early in the campaign there were some of these there's this guy who had like these little rat soldiers, and we're like, oh, that's so cool. We had a piece of property that had like rats in it, and we are like, oh, one of the characters at the time had a pipe of the sewers, and we were gonna have the rats clean the place, and we were gonna like feed them cheese, and it was gonna be like a whole thing. And then for whatever reason, we decided we weren't gonna do it, and my character was like, why? This is so cool. This is so cool. And part of it was like they were saying like, oh, you wouldn't enslave the rats. I'm like, I was trying to help the rats. I was going to give them cheese. I had a ring that allowed me to speak to animals, so I was trying to like negotiate a deal with this head rat. And eventually through doing some work through some from a very specific faction, I was able to get my own pipe of the sewers, and it was a random roll to get
random.
the item. I remember we were rolling, and it was so memorable because it was like it wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't something that Trevor was like, "Here, you get your own pipe of the sewers," because that would feel a little cheap. It was genuinely organic, because I knew that we were rolling. We had been doing this before, I think, for other people.
Yep.
Whenever they were able to complete certain things, they would get something. And then I was like, "Oh my god, I have my own pipe of the sewers." And then the player who had the pipe of the sewers was going to teach me how to play it, but they were going to teach me how to play it wrong. So
She was so salty.
yeah, she's like, why spend time having someone train you to like learn that pipe of the sewers? I'll teach you." And then like, well, maybe that will be a good idea. And then she's like, okay, well now I teach. Whenever we sit down to do it, I teach him how to do it wrong. And it was like, it's terrible. But it was something we'll remember. And there's like a story tied to how did my character get this right, and that remembrance, I think, is really what is in the spirit of D&D. Is after you played through campaigns, you have all these fun stories, you have all these fun memories, you have, you remember certain roles or certain combat encounters, maybe more so than others, and there's always something that makes those specific things very memorable. And I think that's at least for me, that's one of the reasons I play D&D. To make these really nice stories and to have these really cool memories about these adventures.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've been playing for years, and we still talk about that one time, that one thing that happened. And that's great. And it's far more memorable than some TV show or movie that you watched several years ago because you experienced it, you did it, you were the one that influenced it, you saw it with your own two eyeballs. And that's way more fun than experiencing something else. And just briefly touching back on magical items, I think one thing that was really fun was in my last campaign that I ran for you guys. You guys stumbled across an item that was so powerful, but none of you guys could wield it. And you guys all contemplated multi-classing in order to attune yourself to this item.
Well, it was an item that needed a very specific class to use, and none of us had the class to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking at multi-class options for me. I know Console started looking at multi-class options for him. And it turned out like I didn't even get the item, but I decided I was like, taking this multi-class option into Warlock is really good. Outside of like any of the other bonuses that I get, this is actually a pretty solid decision to take this class. I get 3 or 4 different things. I think I got like a free cast of Cure Wounds because I think I went Celestial Warlock because I was playing a Lawful Good Paladin. And there were some cool things that I never even looked at the class to consider, and I was like, what, I'm going to take this even if I don't get the item.
I will say, in retrospect, it was a good thing you didn't take the item.
Yeah, it was. Console really bit the bullet on that one, but it was like, it was a fun time, and it definitely was. It was something that we all had interest in, and that one item made us reconsider the character paths that we had ahead of us. And I think we knew we were getting close to the end campaign, so we were thinking about maybe doing some things that were a little less restrictive. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I'll always remember that story for sure.
It's a classic tale.
But oh my god, it was hilarious.
I can't wait to go back to those characters because that'll be a fun. That'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely, it will be, and I think that's part of us being a group. We've all played together for a long time with this group that we've got together. We know each other really well. Scheduling has been a little bit of an issue, kind of as we come and go, but we've really kept, for the most part, with the exception of unfortunately Gojira, we kept everyone pretty much who's come through. We had like one person not be able to like really make it last session, but he was, or last campaign, but he was new to the coming into the group as it was. But I think the core people that we have are really good, and we all know how to play together. There's some friction sometimes, but we're
like
all
last
we're all really
session.
good friends too. Yeah, last session there was a lot of friction, but we're all good friends too. And at the end of the day, we kind of know, we know what's too much, what's what each person kind of would be comfortable with. We know, you know, kind of what pushes their buttons, and and I think part of that is when you're playing new characters, kind of temper that with, I know what my players are going to be like cool with. I know how they interact with each other, but these new characters, how are they going to interact with each other? And would it be that this character is just kind of a carbon copy of another character this person has played, or is it that they are pretty vastly different? And I definitely think Consul and I, we do kind of mess with each other a little bit, in these campaigns, but I think that's also like it comes out very organically,
Yeah,
right?
like trying to fit the player to player basis on a character to character basis is a ton of fun. Like, oh, I want to mess with that that player, but how does my character mess with that character in a believable sense? Trying to figure that out is a ton of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And something I want to briefly mention is in regards to this long campaign that we've been running. One thing that I believe has worked out well, and something I probably want to do more and more, is we have these characters, and they are now level 15. I've ran two
Are
humongous
they 15 or
adventures.
16?
One of them. What they're level
I
15.
think I think we ended at level
Yeah,
16
you ended at
at
level
the
16.
last encounter. Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing I've done is we played a campaign through those characters, and then we moved on to other characters. And we played another campaign, and then we moved back to those old characters. And I think that is a really great way to do it, because I know for a fact that if we had just played through with those characters nonstop, I feel like there would have been some sort of burnout. I feel like
Oh, absolutely.
there definitely would have been a tiresomeness to playing the same characters over and over again. And most important of all, fondness does, separation does make the heart grow fonder.
Distance makes fondness grow, or whatever the saying is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I remember after the end of that campaign that we that interim campaign, we all were like really excited to play our original characters again. We all were like, oh yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to start playing my paladin, and I know your girlfriend was really excited to play her druid. We all were like very, very fond of going back to those old characters, and there had been like some difference in time. I think it had been like 3 years between, the first campaign that we played with those characters concluded, which was Tomb of Annihilation. It's fine we say that. We played Tomb of Annihilation, then we played Waterdeep, and then we played an upscaled Rime of the Frost Maiden, to kind of bring, that was obviously a lot of the encounters were scaled up. Some of them weren't that they even scaled up much. Rime of the Frost Maiden is an inappropriately deadly campaign.
Oh yes.
For 5th edition. It's super easy to get killed in that campaign if you play things at level. But we were advanced, and even we were struggling with some of the encounters, and we didn't make terribly optimal characters.
No.
We made we've got some pretty powerful characters in our party, but there were some encounters that we were like, man, that was a hard fight. And it's like, yeah, that's actually intended for like a party level 10 characters. We're like, how does Wizards of the Coast expect people to do that? But we were all very excited to play those characters again.
Yeah.
And I think that was because we had fun playing them. We had fun playing, them together. And I think you did a wonderful job as DM of kind of presenting a setting and a place for us to play those characters. It was really good.
Yeah. So I definitely now going forward, I definitely don't want to. If I know for a fact I'm going to run 100 sessions with these characters, I'm not going to run 100 sessions in a row. Never gonna happen. Never.
It's too many. Too many. Like if you think you just can't.
Because we've talked about this before, but the whole Mercer effect, the Critical Role effect of, people want these long, epic campaigns that are 100+ sessions long, levels 1 to 20, global, saving the world, and this and that. I want want campaigns where they're shorter. I want campaigns where the stakes are a lot lower. I want campaigns where it's not levels 1 to 20. I want more tight knit things because I truly believe that if something is small and yet action packed, it's a lot more memorable than something that is long and drawn out because there's going to be a lot of dead space in there.
Well, you running a campaign up to level 20, uh, you let a lot of things out of the bag when you do that, especially if you have any casters in the party. It gets weird. It gets really, really weird once you hit like level 18 or 19.
Oh yes.
Some of the class abilities are totally imbalanced. There's a reason none of the Wizards of the Coast campaigns go anywhere past level 15. I think 15 is the highest that there's any rated campaigns for or intended campaigns for.
Yeah, the only
And
one that truly goes up there is Dungeon of the Mad Mage, but it makes sense because
Dungeon of the Mad Mage it is very much old school D&D of there's a vampire in this room and you open the next door and then there's like a Tarrasque in this room and you kill the Tarrasque and you go to the next door and then there's like it's just room to room to room of combat encounters. Not necessarily, but it is one big long dungeon sprawl. And most of the campaigns that are a little more free form in where you're going, I don't think do that.
no, and I don't think they should because perfect example is if you have to sit down and you tell a story with any of these role playing games, but then the story is truly dictated by the mechanics of the game. Because you can have the same exact story of, okay, there is this noble who's taken over the local, village of 100 people. And if you're running this in, a role-playing game of, I'm just trying to think of one off the top of my head, like, I don't know, let's just go ahead and say for the simplicity here, original D&D. If you run it in original D&D, then it's scary because, as the PCs, they've only got, 4, 5, 6 health, and if they drop to 0, they die. But then all of a sudden you transfer that all the way to 5th edition, and then all of a sudden we see, okay, the wizard gets cantrips, something that wasn't in the originals, and the wizards get, these cool spells, and then the rogue can sneak way better, and the druid can shapeshift, and so they can spy, and the options that you have to try and tell a story are dictated by these mechanics because a lot of the spells and a lot of the class abilities that you get later on in levels flat out remove any semblance of that. For example, being scrying. If you want to have an adventure where the villain is right there in the players' faces, but they can't get him every single time. If your players have the ability to scry, then that sort of ruins it. And yes, there is workarounds to
Well,
scrying, but
I was going to say there are things that you can do, and especially if you're trying to write a smart villain, you want to do. It's like, would the Lich not be casting non-detection on himself, or would he just have like a stone of non-detection that he's always got on him, right?
yeah, for sure.
Certain villains would take certain precautions.
But the fact that you have to think about those precautions as well can certainly eat into
Yeah, yeah.
the story.
It adds to the grocery list of like, okay, what would my villain do, right? And I think being able to die so easily in earlier editions, there was more of a threat. It's like, oh, it's your HP, you're dead. There's no like you fall unconscious and you get 3 death saves and any magical healing brings you up from being unconscious, right? Um, which I've heard in 5th edition, it is very hard to kill your players. I don't necessarily think that's entirely true. I think it's
Yeah.
I think it's hard to kill your players without it feeling like you're trying to kill them. Because it only takes someone to get hit twice in melee when they're downed just to be killed outright.
Or just hit once and then they fail a death save. That
Yeah,
too.
they fail a death save and well, I think if they're in melee and because they're prone and unconscious, it's a critical strike
It's a critical,
and it
meaning
counts
they
as two
failed too.
two
Yeah.
death saves. Yeah, so You have like a big group of trolls and a whole bunch of little goblins on the sidelines that stay out of the fight as the trolls are swinging and hitting people. And as soon as someone goes down, the goblins rush in and slit their throat. It's like, okay, that might probably happen. Yes, but does it feel good? And I think there is it is easy, but do you always want to? Are you is this encounter aiming to be fatal to the players, or is this encounter maybe leading to someplace else, right? And I think looking into alternatives to killing your players, I think is maybe a good opportunity to expand the story, right? Like instead of the goblins killing them, maybe they drag them off, and the players get thrown into these iron cages, and then there's a 10-day journey to some big lair where there's like this ogre overlord who's like having these trolls go out and bring people in for the mines, and then it becomes okay, how do we escape and how do we get our gear back? And you kind of want to recognize, like, am I trying to kill my players, or am I trying to, if they don't succeed in this encounter, what are what's their opportunity for recourse?
Yeah, and in every single action movie or TV show ever, the hero always gets captured. Always, right? Like it always happens. They're either held at gunpoint or they get knocked out and wake up, tied to a chair. That happens every single time, and yet they always find a way to get out. Usually because the villain's monologuing or some Deus Ex Machina shows up. But it's interesting because I have heard no end to the stories of DMs trying to capture their players, but the players literally refuse. Some players would rather have death than be captured. And it does suck, the fact that some people just outright refuse. They say, no, I wouldn't give up. I'd rather die. Would the character honestly think that way? Because I think it's more along the lines of the player not wanting having to deal with that. But in that regard, I'm very thankful that you guys as a group are okay with getting captured, because I think getting captured is great. I think there's a ton of amazing roleplay to be had with being captured over just simply getting killed. Because if
No,
you're
I
killed, that's that
every
end of story.
7 days out of the week, I'd prefer my characters get like captured somehow than just getting outright killed. And because it prevents it from feeling like, oh yeah, I died. That sucked for me. But everyone else lives, but now I have to make a new character. That sucks. That sucks, especially if it's a character that you've been with for a long time. And luckily, fifth edition does give the party revivify and other ways to kind of prevent that. There's gentle repose, so they could go and find a healer, and then it becomes okay. Here's the side quest to, find this seer or this mystic to bring them back to life. Um, but it depends. I mean, sometimes players die, and you know, in older D&D, it was a lot more common, but I think it was also a lot less about the role play. And I think most people today, and I've had some players tell me, they're like, we're really appreciative that you're not just trying to outright kill us all the time. Like we're really happy that you're really focused on making a really cool story for our characters, and it's like good. There are encounters that feel challenging. There are times when people go down in combat. There are times when they finish the combat and everyone's like, at like quarter health or below and out of resources. But that's a good encounter. If you give your players an encounter like that, and it's close and it's difficult, um, that's something that they'll remember. And it's like, wow, that one was like a really close encounter. Like we had last campaign, we had an encounter that I was almost certain we were going to TPK. I was like so certain we were going to TPK
You guys
because
were
there
a
was
single
like,
roll away. I'll tell you that.
yeah, we were single roll away. That happened in one of our, in I remember in TOA we had an encounter where we literally sat there and we were like, it was down to a single roll because of the way the encounters did. We're like, if this
Yep.
person did not hit at this point, we would have TPK'd
Oh yeah.
just because we did not have the resources to do what we needed to do. Um,
In
but
that
it
case,
was,
in particular, that would have been awesome because you guys would have been captured, and that would have led to a lot of fun stuff.
yeah.
But
But
yeah.
like the former though, that encounter, I could not see like I was very. It was an encounter where I was like, this will be the end for our
Oh,
characters. Like
that
this,
and yes. So yeah, the encounter we had last campaign. You guys, there, you guys would have
100%
died.
would have been it. 100% would have been it. And sometimes that has to be it, you know. Sometimes with the in the big bad encounter, you know, it needs to be deadly. It needs to be, you know, something that is going to be very challenging in combat. Um, but you know, I mean, sometimes your players can hopefully do their best to mitigate that and prepare for some of those encounters. But you know, it does suck that if your players are very close to the end of the campaign and then they have just like a TPK from a foe that would not let them live. There's no, they have no, they have 100% vested interest in this character's death, so they would have no interest in
Yeah.
allowing them to live, right? So
And that goes back into the whole rolling in the open thing because if you roll in the open, that's that. You cannot change fate. If you change fate, you're gonna look like a DM that is willing to cheat and lie, and that sucks. If you're
well that
rolling out in the open, you have to roll with the punches. You have to roll with the dice, and if you are rolling behind the screen, you can obviously sit there and fudge some stuff, but I, in particular, in that campaign, I was rolling out in the open, and I knew that could spell absolute death and disaster, but I had to accept that.
yeah, and you know that's part of being honest as a DM, you know, and I think the players feel less cheated when you yourself as a DM roll out in the open and the rolls just are brutal and it's just like, yeah, I saw him roll 2 20s in a row and I got crit twice in a row. And yes, it sucks, but you know that it would be way worse if your DM just said you get crit twice in a row and you don't see him roll the natural 20s. And I think there becomes an onus that your players expect you to not hit them that hard and expect you to kind of like, oh, well, come on, man. It's, you know, it's going hard for me. You want to like maybe not make that a crit.
Then
And, you know,
you become
it
a candy
puts,
DM.
well, and it puts, it's like, okay, you know, you can't, it's like, well, what do you want me to say? Like, I can either roll behind the screen or not. And if you roll out in the open, your players see it, you see it, yeah, it's all out there and transparent. No one can get upset about your integrity as a DM. It never Your integrity as a DM never comes into question when it comes to open roles. Um and I think, you know, I don't know. I always like to roll openly for my parties.
Honestly, I think another aspect of it too is I feel like if I was playing in a game and the DM was rolling behind the screen and I won an encounter, there'd be that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Did the DM allow us to win? But if it's out there in the open, I know without a shadow of a doubt that win or lose, it was because of us, right? And that overcoming that adversity and that challenge is such a great reward. Oh, so good when you beat the bad guy, and even if they are rolling hot and you roll even hotter, or you get that one lucky spell, or in the case of that one in particular, it was they failed one save too many. That's just so epic. That's so great. You have that relief, that just amazing feeling of overcoming the odds, and I love it. And
Well,
yeah,
it needs to feel earned. Go ahead and sorry.
yeah. So speaking of that, overcoming these adversities of going up against these foes or whatever, something I wanted to discuss was factions. So yeah, factions are a great way to allow you to have, whether that be, adversity that your players go up against, or, friends that they can draw upon, or, the factions can do a lot of things, whether that be the native factions of the world, or factions in a dungeon, or there's a lot of different ways you can approach faction play. And that's something I definitely am striving to do more in some of my games. I want there to be factions that the players can join that give them certain bonuses, and it'll make people go either on a case-by-case basis, player-to-player basis, joining different factions, or if the group as a whole joins a faction, because that'll certainly allow them to, receive quests regularly, and it feels organic and real, and allows me to organically reward them as well. And
Well, I think.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No,
No, you go ahead. You're talking. I was gonna say no. I think factions give you great opportunities to kind of set the tone for the setting too. Um, why you can always ask yourself, okay, well, there's a lot of Zentarum in the town, and there's some Flaming Fist in the town. Well, why is that, right? Um, and you can kind of more intricately understand how that faction operates, what they do. If they were displaced, what would happen? Maybe it's you get rid of a faction that's kind of problematic and kind of bad, but then it turns out they were really kind of preventing this other faction from kind of pressing in, who's a lot worse, right? So the role playing aspects of it are really vast, and the opportunities for the players are vast as well. It's also a great way, if you're having trouble figuring out how to start your players off together, start them all together, in a certain faction that you maybe create. It may be that you're like, okay, well, my character wouldn't be interested in being part of the Zentarum, but maybe that could be part of their backstory. One of console characters and Gojira's character, they had been part of the Zentarum in one of our campaign previously, and I think they started off there as well.
Yeah.
And it kind of helped them their characters know each other before we even started, so there was some kind of tie-in as to why the characters would be working together, and it made it easier for them to kind of integrate within the party because they already knew each other, so they could kind of rely on each other a little bit more heavily, right?
Yeah, and that was a great font of course, being able to use them. Of this faction, of course, sees these people and says, "Hey, we're gonna send you over here to do this and that." And of course, I played that up a lot with that campaign in particular because there was a lot of that faction interplay, and I would always be dangling something in front of you. Your character in particular wanted to join an organization, and thus I was like, "Hey, if you go ahead and do this little quest, you'll get some little faction points here," and then you would go along and do that thing, and that was great. And I know in particular, for the next game that I run, specifically the group campaign that I run, not the group campaign, but the open game, I'm going to have some faction interplay with that, where you can, right when you make a character, you join a faction, and that gives you certain bonuses that you get right off the get-go, and you can try and earn as you progress in this faction. And of course, those are just like the generic, guilds or whatever. Those are just the big ones. But there's also the fact that factions don't have to be mega corporations. Factions can just be, there's literally that one gang of thugs versus that other gang of thugs, and you could have that faction interplay in regards of, if you're running a city campaign, then that one gang down the street, the trolley boys versus the ballpark people. You could have that fun faction interplay, whether your players get involved in that as a third person or as joining one of them, and you can have a ton of fun with that. But specifically, I wanted to go over, right this second, I wanted to go over dungeon factions, because more often than not, when you usually sit down and make these dungeons, there's typically only one type of monster, and then they all work together. That's the end of story. But I personally love when we have dungeons that have multiple different groups, and they all have their own little biomes, and they all are adversarial against each other. And I love when my players walk around and they interact with these factions, whether that be in a combat sense or a roleplay sense, and either try and pit them against each other or just get swept up in the middle of it.
Well, it establishes, especially within a dungeon, you have to kind of establish, why is one of these factions here versus the other one? Are they here living here, or are they also exploring just like you? Is it going to be a problem that you go into this dungeon and you maybe bump heads with someone else in this faction, and are they going to live to go and tell the rest of their group about what happened, and are you going to end up on a list somewhere where you're hunted now, right? And being having different like denizens, I think, is very interesting. I think there's maybe a little less wiggle room as much if it's like, okay, you have like a group of goblins and a group of kobolds both living in this cave system, right? And it's a pretty elaborate cave system. Maybe it's pretty big, so there's room enough for them to both exist simultaneously and have conflict. But if it's like a two-room dungeon, then you've kind of got to say, well, why are they here? Maybe there is a body in there that has the insignia and gear of a certain faction. He's got a special item on him, and if you take it, maybe it's recognizable to the rest of the faction, and they're like, "Where did you get that?" That was someone, maybe it was someone important that had that item, and it can create a consistent friction, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can create kind of a consistent friction with other NPCs in the world, um, based on that, right? And some maybe you might get, maybe if you take the Zentarum signet and you put it on yourself, they think you're part of the Zents and you can infiltrate them. Or maybe you find a faction that doesn't like the Zentarum and they think that you're one of the Zentarum and they try and capture you and interrogate you, and you're like, oh, I don't know anything. I stole it from a dead man, right? Um, but it creates something to where it's like, okay, even if I kill every single person in this room, there are other people that already know about this, and the encounter's not over, and the chase is not over, and maybe I'll still be pursued, and maybe I won't, right? And there's a lot of intricacies when you have an organized group of people working together to either help or hinder the party. It never just becomes one encounter. It's always a long kind of haul of different things to do.
Yeah, the whole thing about factions in Forgotten Realms anyway is that there's the big six, the Zentarum, Lords Alliance, Emerald Enclave, etc., etc. All those, they certainly have this big old feel of a huge corporation, and then you join a single cell, and that single cell operates a little bit differently, and they have their own separate set of missions and all that fun stuff. And infiltrating these factions, and can be a blast. But one of the things is joining these factions in the original fifth edition, or not original fifth edition, but like in fifth edition natively, there wasn't any real hardcore rules on progressing in a faction. There wasn't natively anything written down in regards of bonuses. With Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, we did get a little bit of a touch on group patrons, which would be essentially a faction, but it didn't go into mechanical detail about what you would get for working with them for too long. So that is something you have to sit down and you have to consider. Okay, if my players want to be badass, awesome heroes, and they are working their way through the ranks, is it going to be like, the Elder Scrolls, where in the span of a week, my players could theoretically be the heads of these factions? Or is it going to be more along the lines of, are the heads of this faction so big and so powerful and so influential that the players wouldn't realistically, in the scope of the campaign, be able to obtain that sense of leadership and whatnot? And
Well, you could have.
yeah,
Go ahead.
no, you.
I was gonna say you could have situations where, and we did this specifically in one campaign, where we were in a place, and we knew who like the head of this place was, but someone else came to us and was like, hey, I want to be in charge, and if you help me, there might be something in it for you. And there became like this cool kind of internal struggle. So it's not even just like the factions are either working to help or hinder the party, but maybe there's even like kind of sub factions within the overall faction itself, where you've got some people who are, of this mind or don't like the leader and would rather see this person be put into power. And that can be its own thing entirely. And what happens if that you get caught doing that and it fails, right? Well, are you going to be like executed with the traitors? Are you going to be imprisoned? Are you going to just be completely thrown out of the faction entirely? And I think kind of on like rule sets for it, I think it's really hard to write rule sets for specific faction stuff because outside of guidelines, every faction and every person's campaign is probably going to be running a bit differently. Even in the pre-written Wizards of the Coast campaign, I think that the people who, or I think that the DMs who will play those certain characters, they'll probably be played differently, and the way the players and the PCs interact with those people in those factions is going to be more dynamic. So I think there needs to be a bit of fluidity, which 5e is very good at. It's not extremely rigid, but at the same time, I think there should be maybe some kind of like, okay, a major faction would be, at the very top, you would find characters of this level within Forgotten Realms. Like whoever runs the Red Wizards of Thay, it's probably a very powerful wizard. You know, whoever runs the Zentarum is probably a very powerful individual. And if they wanted to avoid getting overthrown, they probably would need to be. And I think that kind of understanding how the factions operate within the setting, I think would help you build the kind of hierarchy within the factions themselves.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Like we typically try and build these campaigns around our players, but at the same time, we want there to be a structure to the world. Like I just mentioned, is a game going to have a thing where your players start off in this faction and then eventually can, by the end of it, become the leaders of the faction? It really depends on the scope and scale of the campaign. It depends on the scope and scale of this faction. If it is, a big old faction such as the Zentarum or the Red Wizards or whoever else, it probably isn't realistic in the scope of a small scale campaign that they would be able to do that. But if it is a much smaller faction, and if it's only like the cell of in a small little portion of the world, then yeah, I think that's definitely obtainable, especially because typically what happens in most campaigns is right from the get-go, every monster, every single NPC, their stats never change throughout the course of the campaign, but your players do. And that's always something to consider is, are the heads of these factions and are the muscle of these factions, are they getting any smarter? Are they getting stronger? Are they getting more powerful? Or are they just, NPC sheets that'll never change ever? And if that is the case, then yeah, eventually your players will be able to beat them. But if they are advancing as well throughout the entirety, then I think that also leads to a sort of organicness, because as your players are growing stronger over time, then they can also look up and see that their peers are getting stronger as well. And that can be a fun little race as well. Maybe your players see that, okay, that rival faction there, they have, their own set of adventures and they're going out doing awesome, cool things. We want to keep up with them and eventually we want to be better than them. And that'll hopefully drive your players to going forward. Hopefully that'll drive your players to be better than someone else, because once again, having that antagonism in the game, having that, drive to push yourself forward is awesome.
Well, I think more importantly, you need to kind of keep into consideration what are the faction's goals, both long term and short term, um, and what are the implications of them succeeding in their goals, right? So, if you have like one head of the faction is after a certain magical item, is it for him or is it for something he's trying to use it for? Uh, is it that, maybe this faction is a religious faction and they're gaining a lot of steam in the region, and they have all of a sudden, they've got a huge amount of influence now, and they don't even really need to fight you because they've turned the people against either the players or someone, or they've organized in a way that challenges what the status quo currently is. And you can certainly get into things where it's like it becomes much more important to prevent these things from happening or to curtail these things from happening. So maybe some factions don't become too powerful. If they did, how would it affect other factions? Maybe if you are running a campaign that is a little heavily, or excuse me, a little more heavily faction based, how would other factions react to that faction too, right? Maybe you have factions that wouldn't normally work together, but under the threat of, one of the factions gaining too much power, they do, right?
And I think another thing to consider is, you touched up on this, but what happens if your players act on something, or more importantly, they don't act on something? How do the players influence the game? Because whether the players act or they choose to not do anything, they are impacting the world. So, is the players refusing to accept the quest? What's that going to mean in the long term of things? How's that going to relate to the relationship that they have with that faction? Or maybe not doing anything with that faction is going to make them look better with that other faction. Or maybe if your players do that one quest, maybe they were betrayed because there was someone within the faction that totally set them up, and that makes them look bad. You know, whatever course of action your players take, and of course that can be nothing, that will have later ramifications. Because if it doesn't have any later ramifications, then once again your players are going to see that there is no point in doing anything, because if nothing happens, then what's the point of doing anything, right? And I think that's
Well,
always
you have to
something
have a
important to
dynamic
consider.
world.
Yeah, you gotta have the world react to the players. You can't just to sit there and have it be putty that doesn't get moved around at all. You need your players to recognize the change that they make, because later on, whether the consequences of that action were good or bad, they will reflect upon that. If something bad happens because of their actions, they'll be kicking themselves and say, hey, dang it, we should have done that other thing, or we should have joined that other faction, because the faction we joined is full of assholes and that are totally using us. And then that leads to fun times. That leads to realization both on a player's sense and on a character sense. They'll maybe if your players join a faction and then they get betrayed, they'll start being a lot more paranoid, and that'll seed into that character's persona of, I got betrayed once and I'm not going to allow that to happen to me ever again. Or if your players join a really great faction that gives them candy and gold left, right, and center, then they'll probably be too trusting, and that can potentially lead to some downside later on. That's a fun time as well.
Well, I think one thing too is how are these factions, even if the players choose not to engage in these factions, how are the factions going to be reacting to the things that they do in the world? Because at a certain point, when your players become strong enough and have done enough important things that may or may not be well known, maybe some factions start taking notice, and they're like, hey, you being in this area is kind of disruptive to us. We want you to leave. Maybe you're helping out these people a little too much, and you need to get on your way, right? And more importantly, are your players, willfully or not, are they perceived to be their own faction in what they're doing in the world? Is what they're doing on such a large scale where it is affecting larger things that maybe they start having people come to them? I mean, it would make sense that if you have like a group of like 4 or 5 or 6 13th level characters, that's a note. That's like seeing 5 celebrities walking down the street at the same time altogether, right? The only difference is that these people can probably like kill most of the people in the street right now. um, but when you're at that height of power, do you have, and let's say you're staying in a city or you're staying in a place that's relatively populated, do you all of a sudden have people who are like, oh my gosh, my niece is sick and I need you to heal her? Do you have, the local nobles coming to your character saying, you guys are the kind of people I need a job for, that only you can do? And as you become more noticeable in the world, how is that? Because it's going to have an effect somehow. And I think it is very natural for players to kind of, especially with the fact that they're kind of organized together, it can be very natural for them to form their own faction without even really kind of seeing it that way. And, they really are, though. I mean, if you have an organized group of people, even though it's, not a ton, it's not like 100 or 200 people, but they have an organized group with a goal. And, there are sometimes an implication to that in itself. Just by being who you are, you draw attention, especially at the later levels.
Yeah, it states in the player's handbook and the DMG that on a level 1 to 4 basis, you're relatively nobodies. On a 5 to 10 scale, then you are recognized in your local county or whatever. On 11 through 16, I want to say, or maybe 15, then a decent number of people would know you, and then 17 through 20, you are the heroes of
Like a
legend.
legendary figure of myth almost.
Yeah. And that reflects in, of course, what they've done throughout the entirety of the campaign, because obviously that isn't a 1-for-1 basis. You could be running a campaign where your players level up every single session after killing 2 orcs, and they only hung around one place, and then of course no one would know who they are. But if you're running a more organic campaign where your players are moving around, shaking things up in a area, then word of mouth is going to spread. If you're running a city campaign and they only interact with this one city and they do a ton of quests in the city, then of course the nobles are going to be talking to each other, and then the commoners are going to overhear this, and then everyone's going to know everything, right? And that just is just natural part of exploring around, getting more powerful, getting more famous, and maybe even more infamous depending on the actions that your players take. And that feels awesome. That feels great, starting off a campaign as a nobody and then becoming a somebody. That makes so much sense. I'm trying to think, like, in all the campaigns that I run, by the end of it, everybody recognizes the awesome deeds that you've taken, and of course tries to reward you. But at the same time, because you're so big and powerful and famous, then people want you for something. For example, being, if there is a high level cleric, then everyone's gonna come up to them and say, "Hey, can you bring my so and so back to life?" And then you have to sit there and go, "Ugh, that costs money," and
Yeah,
then
it costs money. These people are in need, and it really puts things into a perspective, though, right? Because they become kind of the figure that they may have been searching for 5 or 6 or 7 levels ago, where they're like, oh my god, we have to find the healer to bring our friend back. And then, here's a high level healer who's just like, look, I got people to see and dungeons to delve and things to do, right? Like, but in order just to find someone of that power scale, they have to have done something noticeable. Ninth level characters are, pretty strong. It takes a great effort to get to ninth level. And, because of what you have at that level, your capacity for, doing damage or healing people or dispelling effects. If you were in a pool where there's a lot of people below you, a majority of people probably below what your power scale is, you're going to have a lot of people coming to you for their problems. And it could be very lucrative just by being that powerful, you know? You could certainly have it to where your players retire for a while or take it easy in a while for a city over a 3-month period. Um, and, while some DMs are probably like, oh, I'm a little opposed to that, sometimes it can be very appropriate, as maybe you're waiting for a certain season or you're waiting for something else, or maybe it's a little more of a free form campaign. But absolutely give them an opportunity to kind of go and with their downtime, do certain things. And if you're going out and you're healing peasants for free, you're probably going to wake up every door with a line of people there
oh yeah.
ready, and you've only got so many resources, and how much of you are you going to start charging for that? And it becomes very interesting because your players become more permanent fixtures in the world, because of what they've done and who they are. And I think that's really a rewarding experience when you feel like your characters exist in the world because of the way that they influence the world. And that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I try to bring this up into every campaign, but I always like the adoring fan. I always like the idea of your players do something awesome, and then that squire or that person shows up and says, "You guys are awesome. Can you teach me?" I like that idea because at some point your players may have wanted a mentor to guide them, and then now they are the mentor figures. And I think thrusting that mentorship onto the players is great because, you get to truly see how they act in regards of when they're with the party and doing whatever versus if they're trying to interact with someone that adores them, right? Getting to see them evolve as a person is fantastic. And, the adoring fan one in particular, good old Gerald is the classic one.
Well, it's a lot of fun. A lot of players love that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's that's something like if you're gonna look back at older module not older modules but older editions of the game, having those squires and having the hirelings and having those other people that follow around the party, it just makes sense. Of course, if there is that a level 15 ranger that can shoot a dragon 600 feet in the air, every single person that ever picks up a bow is going to want to go up to that person and say, "Can you teach me how to do that?" You have that epic fighter that went toe to toe with the giant, the storm giant. Then of course every fledgling fighter is going to show up and say, "Hey, can you show me how to move like you move? Can you show me how to attack like you attack?" It just makes sense. And it feels so awesome, not only getting to do your deeds that make you awesome, but getting to relive them through these people that adore you for it. And truly, you get to make an impact in the world. And I think that's kind of, a cool part of leveling up over time is getting to see that impact that you have made, whether that be on a relatively small scale or it could be on a very large one. And
Well, and I
yeah.
think that like oh no, go ahead.
No, you.
Yeah, all right, all right. I was gonna say, and that's kind of how like tying it back into factions. That's how your players can kind of become a faction without really intending to.
Yeah.
Is they become factions exist in the world because there are atypical people, typically pretty strong people who have a lot of followers and they have a lot of influence. And your players would very naturally go into that role the more important they become. There could be people who believe in your players in a different way than your players believe in themselves. You can have a character who is the reluctant hero, right? Where you're just like, yeah, we go out and we do this stuff and that stuff, and I'm not after it for the fame, but they still become famous because they may have killed a local red dragon that have been terrorizing villages in like a huge 50-mile radius, right? And all these villages all of a sudden consider you a hero. And all of a sudden you go to a town and there's a statue that's like maybe not really in your likeness, but it's got your
They
name on the
tried.
plate, right? They try. They may have they don't might not know who you are, but they get a description of you, right? And it might be something that your characters or your PCs are like a little uncomfortable with, but I guarantee most players will think it's cool to some extent to see that what their characters do matters more than just the immediate, like, we killed the dragon, we got the loot, we turned the dragon into like dragon hide like armor and shields, and we took the teeth and we maybe made a few weapons or daggers out of it, right? And they get that cool stuff, but then the impact of what happens, right? And maybe after they kill that dragon, maybe another one moves into its later layer, or a layer later. That's a tongue twister.
Dragon layer later.
Later, or maybe becomes like a layer for someone else, or maybe the PCs move in and they make it their own little like mountain fort, and they take some of the gold and they invest it into stonemasons and make a more permanent place. I always love the idea of as players owning something that is physical in the world, whether it be like a ship or a base or something, right?
Yeah.
And as a DM, I love it when my players do that because it gives me opportunity to, I don't want to say exploit exploit it, but it kind of is. You kind of like
I
you're
can
like, hey,
hold it against them later. Yes.
like you guys come in and you see that there's there's something happening right to your base, or maybe like in your absence, as you guys have been gone in 3 months, the people you paid to hire it have like run it into disrepair,
Yeah.
or you know there was a break-in, right? And it gives more role play opportunities uh, for you as a DM to introduce to your players that you otherwise really wouldn't have uh, quite the same avenue to do.
Yeah. It's all about going from those humble beginnings to the awesome. And, it's all about the transition from being a nobody to being a somebody. And, that is always fantastic. And speaking of nobodies here, let's go ahead and take one last look as we wrap up
Oh,
this
this little halfling rogue,
this
classic halfling rogue. So
halfling rogue.
Frauk Alropo, stout halflings get a bonus to Dex and Con, so I no longer have a negative con,
Hey, look at that.
which is really good. Like having a at least a neutral constitution is good. You really don't want to have con as a negative stat. So yeah, he's got 10 con, not too bad. He's got 14 strength, really good for a rogue. 18 dex, 10 con, 10 int, 10 wisdom, and 13 charisma. As a rogue, you get dex and int as your proficient saving throws, but he doesn't have too terrible strength saves either, which is good
This
for a rogue.
this little halfling's been working out.
He has been. He's got, so my skills I took, criminal gives me a few, and I think it was stealth and sleight of hand is what criminal gave me. Let me look.
Damn, a +8 to
Criminal.
stealth at level 1. Mamma mia.
Yeah, so I get deception and stealth, excuse me. So it's deception and stealth, which is pretty good. And then I took acrobatics, athletics, persuasion, and sleight of hand, because rogues get 4 skills they're proficient in, which is crazy. And for my expertise, I put one in one of my expertise is in stealth, so up to 8 stealth. He's very, very sly and stealthy. Look at that. I actually can't see that roll. 22 and 25. And then I actually put my other expertise in athletics, because athletics is very good. And despite it being the only strength skill, which is maybe a little controversial, but athletics is so general. It can be anything from like lifting something to pushing.
It's
Anything that's
no
like
longer
requires
just
physical.
open doors, bend bars.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it is a very general skill that applies to a lot of physical things, right? But having good athletics and acrobatics, especially when they're the same, makes you pretty much as good as either as them, right? Because usually it's not the case. Usually you're good at athletics, or you're good at acrobatics, or you're not very good at both. But having a 6 in athletics, that's running, that is climbing, that is a lot of physical stuff.
And hey, every once in a while you can grapple someone, which is pretty dope.
I can grapple someone. It needs to be someone who I assume is going to be small, because I think I have disadvantage on things that are a size higher than me. Am I correct in that, Mr. Trevor?
I believe so, yeah.
I think so. I would rule it so if it wasn't the rule. That's how I would do it. I'd be like, no, you're too small. You need it is
as the halfling, but you grappled the Tarrasque.
Well, but there's a lot of effects that will where you're grappled or restrained, where you need to roll that athletics. And sometimes it is just athletics. It's not athletics or acrobatics. Yep. It's just athletics. So I figured that was pretty good. Having a 6 athletics for a halfling rogue, I think, is very good.
Yeah, for sure.
I
certainly can't wait to see this guy in action, because I think
he's not a bad character. He's pretty good.
Yeah, I think he could be very interesting. But
again, I did have like a floor of 6.
Yeah, you had a floor of 6. Yeah.
Yeah, which I did not. The closest was a 9, which it's not that far away, but still, it's pretty.
It was arguably in the ones that you really didn't want him, but
Yeah.
But you live with the dice and you die by the dice. That is gonna wrap it up for today's the podcast. Anything last you want to say here?
No, I think this is a good character. I'm proud of Frauk. I think this is a good podcast today. I think we covered a lot of interesting topics. And no, thank you for having me, Trevor.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this was fun. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to all my lovely patrons up here. You guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you so very much. That is gonna do it for this one, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.